much for the invitation. As I said, what I wanted to do is ask this question, which I think is particularly pertinent in developing countries and those which are thinking about just energy transitions, is whether or not an energy transition is particularly just if it doesn't address the issue of energy poverty. I am on the slide. Aren't I right? Okay. So, I mean, if we have a look at current conceptualizations of a just transition, the overarching theme when we look at definitions of what a just transition is supposed to be, and we look at policies and programs that follow that just transition, there really is a key theme, and that is that those people who have been negatively implicated by the move away from coal, so it's in coal miners, people who work in the coal value chain, particular areas whose economies are linked to the coal sector, that they must be compensated for this move away from coal. Now, I believe that that's necessary, but is that sufficient to conceptualize a truly just energy transition? And I think what we can do is we can call this mitigation approach, that a just transition is about mitigating the negative impacts of moving away from coal. But it's a reactive approach. And what it implies, although that is never said out loud, is that there's nothing fundamentally unjust about the current energy system apart from its climate impact, that everything about it is just and equitable. And of course, the reality is very, very different. We look at power, electricity systems in developing countries, they're fundamentally inequitable, and they're not delivering universal access to electricity. And that is even when we have high levels of physical access to electricity. So in South Africa, we have an 86% household electrification rate. But if we look at the ability of households to actually use electricity to be able to improve their lives, it's much, much lower than that. And the point is that if we only consider mitigation of decarbonization, that is having a look at reskilling workers in the coal sector and revitalizing areas around the coal system, we're simply going to move to a decarbonized, but still significantly inequitable and unjust energy system, particularly in respect of electricity. So why do we say that universal access is key to a just energy transition? Well, firstly, I think that there's a strong development case to be made for universal access to electricity. There is a lot of data that shows that households that have access to electricity, and by that electricity that they can afford to use and affordable energy sources, are much more likely to start their own small enterprise than a household that doesn't. Access to electricity enables small enterprises to engage in more activities. It allows households to engage in additional economic activities to keep their businesses open for longer. There are also clear linkages between access to clean and safe energy like electricity and household food security status. Access to affordable electricity is critical for cooking. In developing countries, energy is the mostly required for cooking as opposed to heating in most of the global north. So there are all sorts of linkages between socioeconomic development and access to electricity, which make a good case for including universal access in our definitions of a just energy transition. But there's one other factor, which my sense is that working on South Africa's just transition program, one issue that international funders and funding organizations have not really applied their minds to at all, and that is that unless we incorporate universal access to electricity into our just transitions, we're not going to get broad-based and thus political support for a move away from fossil fuels. And we very much see that in South Africa. There is a strong political imperative behind retaining fossil fuels and not moving away from coal. And that is supported by a broad-based, albeit erroneous perception that fossil fuels are key to universal affordable electricity. It's a little bizarre in South Africa. People say, well, we can't afford electricity, so we have to have coal, whereas we have nothing but coal and no one can afford electricity. But no one's kind of worked out that particular paradox there. But the point is that there needs to be a strong development dividend from the just transition for there to be broad-based political support. And people talk about, people in the global north will say, yes, but, if we decarbonize, then we're going to address climate change and everybody benefits from that. And well, the benefits are not proportionately allocated. If you're a poor, destitute person, the prospect of your children being poor and destitute in an environment where the climate is stable is actually not much of a selling point. So there has to be a much more important dividend from the transition, and that dividend is specifically required to be in access to electricity. So once again, there's a misconception among many of the donors that what people want to benefit from the just transition is jobs and employment. And of course, in a country like South Africa, which has incredibly high levels of unemployment, that is an issue. But our own ethnographic research in the Northern Cape of South Africa around the communities that live around large-scale renewable solar projects is that, first of all, they are very underwhelmed and disenchanted with these projects. But most importantly, that their unhappiness with these projects got very little to do with who got a job at the solar farm or who got a contract there, but the fact that there is the site producing vast amounts of electricity right next to a community that doesn't have electricity. So there's this linkage that people are making, quite logically, between greater investment in renewable generation of power and their own ability to access electricity, which is not being seen in practice. And what has happened until now is that really the just energy transition in South Africa and the move away from renewables has really avoided talking in detail about energy poverty. The just transition framework in South Africa says, well, energy poverty is bad and we must do something about it. And that really is the extent of the discussion. Whereas the fossil fuel lobby is making a much stronger case for the linkages between fossil fuels and access to energy. And if we don't incorporate meaningful progress towards universal access into the JETPs, and if we are not clear about allocating funding to this and prioritizing it, then popular support and thus political commitment is going to be very limited. And one gets the impression, certainly in the South African JETP, that this is the first time the international donor community has really had to think very hard about the factors that influence the implementation or lack of implementation of projects, and things like this political and popular buy-in. And as I said, the fact that the renewable lobby and the JETPs have not specifically incorporated universal access to energy has really created this enormous narrative and discursive gap, which has been very successfully co-opted by the fossil fuel lobby. And there is this general perception now in South Africa that cheap coal is necessary to address energy poverty, even though all the empirical evidence suggests that exactly the opposite is happening. So if we agree on that, then there's a next step to that, which is, what is universal access? What kind of access to electricity should we be talking about in our just transition? Well, the first point to make is that we believe very strongly that the current measures of progress towards universal access, the measures that are encapsulated by SDG 7, which is really just about physical access, are inadequate. And also, I would say the World Bank multi-tier framework is also inadequate, because it talks about 1 kilowatt hour of electricity per household per day. Although in fairness, it does strip that out from cooking requirements, but it is still an incredibly low level of access. And our point is that none of these measures are measuring what we would call enabling access. And we would define enabling access as the kind of access that actually delivers meaningful socioeconomic development. And meaningful socioeconomic development is not delivered by a household being able to kind of power 2 light bulbs and a television, for example. And as I said earlier, South Africa is the best example worldwide for how physical access, which is very high, is very far from enabling access. I would say to guess that 2/3 of households that, an educated guess, that 2/3 of households in South Africa that have access to electricity don't have enabling access. Why? Because they cannot afford to access the level of electricity that they really need to make a difference in their lives. So what we've said, and we've explored this notion in the book that was referred to, the book that's available as in a free ebook download, is we've want to talk about something called a minimum threshold level of consumption. And we've conceptualized this as the level of consumption at which meaningful socioeconomic development benefits are realized. So when a household consumes below that level, yes, there is some benefit to the household, but there isn't really this level of access that allows the whole household to significantly improve their lives through better cooking and food storage, through engaging in more and better livelihood opportunities, through the reduction of health negative outcomes from indoor air pollution, etc., etc. And this minimum threshold level of consumption obviously varies by context. What it is an empirical question. It will be different from country to country. In South Africa, we've conceptualized that at 350 kilowatts per household per month, but it would obviously be different in different countries and different environments. It's more the idea that there is a certain minimum level of consumption we should be aspiring for in terms of universal access, as simply a plug in the wall that is the idea. And then when we have a look at the issue of access, it's the ability of households to afford this level of consumption that must be considered, not whether or not a household can afford 1 kilowatt hour of electricity every day, but whether or not a household can actually afford this level of consumption. So the next question to ask that is, how should we conceptualize affordability? Affordability is obviously critical to the whole idea of universal access. Once you've got past a physical connection, and once you've got past the idea that there's a certain minimum amount of consumption that households require. How should we conceptualize affordability? How should we decide what amount of money is affordable and what amount of money is unaffordable? And once again, we've taken issue with this idea that you can set that in terms of a percentage of household income. So the common measure in Global North is to say, if a household is spending more than 10% of its income on electricity or energy, then it's unaffordable. If it's less than 10%, it's affordable. And the World Bank talks about 5%. Well, the first thing we could do is we could, households self-limit their consumption. So just to say that a household is only spending, let's say, 3 or 4% of its household income on electricity makes it affordable, doesn't really reflect the minimum threshold level of consumption. But even if we have a look at the affordability of the minimum threshold level of consumption, we don't believe that percentage of income is suitable in a very high poverty environment, i.e. most of the global south and certainly in South Africa. And that is because a significant percentage of very poor households have high levels of food insecurity. And high levels of food insecurity and child malnutrition have all sorts of negative socioeconomic development outcomes, which often development programs are trying to improve. And what we have found is in our research, and I'm sure it's replicated in many other countries, is that the most common expenditure trade-off for households to buy electricity is food. And that is particularly in urban households. And I think that we see that in many instances where food is often traded off for other categories of expenditure, because it's the one expenditure item where households have more or less greater flexibility to cut expenditure, as opposed to what they've got to pay for accommodation or what they've got to pay for transport. So what we see in South Africa is quite clearly that a significant percentage of households are sacrificing food expenditure in order to pay for electricity. Now, if you have a situation as we have, where 25% of all households live below the food poverty line, what you have is a situation where total household income is not sufficient to purchase a minimum basket of nutritious food. In that environment, no expenditure on electricity should be considered affordable, we think, because even if that household spends R1 on electricity, that is coming out of a food budget that is already inadequate. So what we've developed is what we've called a food-first approach to affordability, which is that we need to think about affordability of electricity in respect of its impact on the household food budget. Because as soon as we are requiring households to trade off food for electricity, we're creating lose-lose outcomes. And that's both for households and for our national Development Goals. So what does affordable universal access look like? Once again, bearing in mind that what we're aiming for is all households to have access to the minimum of the minimum threshold level of consumption. We said for very poor households, so that would be 25% of all households in South Africa, no tariff is affordable. For many moderately poor households, only a very low tariff is affordable. And the other important point to make is that in this environment, the argument which is often made by the renewable lobbies is that, yes, renewables are cheaper than coal. Yes, they might be cheaper than coal, but that is not extremely helpful where a household actually can't afford to pay anything for electricity. And that's where we need additional measures. So we need to start thinking, we would say, about access to electricity as analogous as access to education in terms of its impact. We all understand that access to quality education, yes, it benefits the individual, but it is absolutely critical to national and social goals of economic development. So we wouldn't have a situation where we say you can only access education if you can pay for it. We also wouldn't confuse the building of a school with access to quality education. We wouldn't even confuse building a school and simply staffing it with quality to access education. We'd focus our attention on exactly what is being achieved by that education and what it is delivering. So if we start thinking about access to electricity as analogous to access to education, then we start to think about how we need to fund it in a different way. And what that means really is that end user subsidies are critical to access. South Africa has a situation where we have stepped tariffs, where lower users pay lower tariffs combined with a free basic electricity allowance. But if you consider the fact that 25% of households can't afford to pay anything for electricity and probably 55% can only afford to pay a very small amount, then what we have is a situation where the free units are inadequate and even the lowest step tariff is too high. I think the principle is sound, a combination of tariffs and end user subsidies. The question then is where you draw the line. And we would say that in South Africa, in order to achieve a just transition, we need to draw the line where probably 50% of households need to get 350 kilowatt hours of free electricity every month. And the point is that end user subsidies also generate additional benefits in growing electricity markets and supporting grid expansion and financing the kind of grid expansion we want. A meaningful end user subsidy can transform a community that would be seen by investors as a very bad place to invest in terms of electricity distribution into good customers with a predictable flow of income. So there is a significant benefits, not just for individual households, but also for growing and expanding and stabilizing electricity markets. And then just one last point, we often come across people who say, yes, what we need to do is we need to put, a little solar system in every house. That might be a solution in some places, but in South Africa, we already have very high levels of electrification, and where the cost of systems that would actually deliver the amounts of electricity that households need is prohibitive. We really believe that the most suitable answer would be utility scale provision of renewables combined with end user subsidies as the preferred model for delivering universal access. And I'm going to stop there. I hope we can have a discussion.